moment of respect turns into a scene of horror when an armed officer does the unthinkable in front of the nation's most decorated military leaders. As the world watches in shock, one question remains: how far will justice go when the target is a black woman in power? Let us know in the comments section below. The crowd stood in silent formation, a sea of pressed uniforms and dark suits stretching across Arlington National Cemetery. The air was thick with the weight of mourning, a collective grief held together by discipline and duty. At the front of the gathering, standing at the podium, was General Olivia Carter. Posture rigid, expression unreadable. Her uniform, adorned with ribbons and medals earned through decades of service, reflected the morning light as she spoke into the microphone. Colonel Benjamin Strauss was more than a soldier. He was a leader, a mentor, a friend to those fortunate enough to serve alongside him. Today we do not only lay a man to rest, but we honor his legacy, his sacrifices, and the unwavering dedication he gave to this nation. The funeral was dignified, as expected of a ceremony honoring one of the nation's most respected military figures. Rows of white headstones lined the horizon, a stark reminder of the cost of service. Flags waved at half-mast. The air, once still, trembled as the sound of a lone bugler prepared for taps. In the back of the gathering, Officer Daniel Reeves stood with his arms crossed, his fingers tapping impatiently against the stiff fabric of his police-issued jacket. His jaw clenched as he eyed the woman at the podium. A black general, a woman standing where only men used to stand. A disgrace. His fingers twitched toward his belt. He hadn't wanted to attend this funeral, but his precinct expected a presence out of respect for the fallen soldier. Instead, all he saw was a performance, a spectacle designed to feed the illusion of power. His voice was low at first, a muttered sneer under his breath. This is what the country's come to? Letting people like her take center stage? A few heads turned, side eyes filled with disapproval, but no one said anything. Then he said it louder. Unbelievable! The murmurs of unease rippled through the crowd. Someone shifted away from him, a deliberate step back. A woman in civilian clothes glanced at him sharply, her brows furrowed. The honor guards stood at attention, unbothered by the shift in atmosphere. But among the funeral attendees, tension began to build like a slow, rolling storm. General Carter continued speaking, unaware of the crack forming in the moment. Reeves, fueled by a rage he barely understood, pushed forward through the crowd, his boots crunching against the gravel path. His breathing became labored, every muscle in his body tightening with fury. The murmurs around him grew louder, warning him with cautious glances and whispered urgencies. "Sir, I think you need to." He didn't hear the rest. His hand moved on instinct. His fingers wrapped around cold steel, and before anyone could process what was happening, the funeral transformed from a moment of tribute to a nightmare. Gasps filled the air. Someone screamed. Reeves had drawn his gun. The crowd froze. Every uniformed officer and soldier in attendance stiffened, their hands hovering over their own holsters, caught between disbelief and protocol. General Carter, standing at the podium, finally turned. Her expression didn't waver. "Put the gun down." Her voice was even, unshaken. For a split second, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. The world seemed to move in slow motion, yet everything was happening at once. The instant Officer Daniel Reeves raised his gun, the air inside Arlington National Cemetery shifted, thick with the sudden, paralyzing weight of danger. Gasps rippled through the mourners, and for a brief moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Reeves's arm was locked, his grip on the pistol unwavering as he aimed directly at General Olivia Carter. His face twisted in fury, eyes burning with something deeper than hatred, something primal. His knuckles turned white against the handle, finger hovering too close to the trigger. A voice cut through the panic, strong, commanding. "Put the gun down." General Carter stood firm at the podium, her expression unreadable, her voice carrying the weight of decades of battlefield command. She was no stranger to tense standoffs, but this was different. This was supposed to be sacred ground. This was supposed to be a place of honor. Reeves's breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling in erratic heaves. He didn't lower the weapon. In the crowd, hands reached for holsters, but the soldiers and officers hesitated. One wrong move and a shot would be fired. A second too late, and a life would be taken. The tension was a hair's width from snapping. A young soldier near the front instinctively took a step forward, but his superior grabbed his arm, shaking his head in warning. One step too close, and this would end in blood. Captain Marco Ruiz had been watching from the side, standing in the row of decorated officers seated near the podium. The moment the gun was drawn, his instincts kicked in. His chair scraped against the pavement as he bolted upright, his mind already mapping out the only way this could end without a funeral turning into a massacre. He didn't wait. His boots barely made a sound against the gravel as he surged forward. The crowd blurred in his peripheral vision. All that mattered was the weapon, the man holding it, and the woman standing, unshaken in its sights. Reeves's hands tensed, his finger twitching over the trigger. His lips curled back, a venomous snarl escaping from clenched teeth. "She doesn't belong here," he spat, his voice hoarse, almost unhinged. General Carter's expression never changed. Then everything exploded at once. Ruiz tackled Reeves, the full force of his body slamming into the officer's side. A gunshot rang out, splitting the air like a crack of thunder. Screams erupted. A flock of birds scattered from the trees, their wings slicing the silence that followed. The bullet soared into the sky. Reeves crashed to the ground, the gun jolting from his grip as he struggled beneath Ruiz's weight. The two men wrestled in the dirt, Reeves thrashing, his face contorted with rage. "Get off me!" he roared, his voice raw and desperate. Ruiz didn't give him the chance to recover. His knee drove into Reeves' back, pinning him down. In an instant, another set of hands joined him. 2 military police officers, then another. Handcuffs clicked into place, snapping around Reeves' wrists. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body heaving against the restraints, but the fight was over. He was subdued, disarmed, but the damage had been done. A wave of whispers surged through the crowd, panic and disbelief thick in the air. Someone had recorded the entire thing. Phones were raised, lenses capturing the image of an armed police officer taken down at a military funeral, the echoes of a gunshot still ringing in their ears. General Carter hadn't moved. Slowly, she exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She turned, scanning the shaken faces in the crowd, eyes filled with horror, anger, a deep, bone-deep exhaustion that could only come from witnessing the same violence over and over again, in different forms, in different places, but always with the same underlying hatred. She straightened her shoulders. Proceed with the ceremony. The crowd hesitated, unsure, unwilling to move past what had just transpired. But the honor guard, trained to obey orders even under the most unimaginable circumstances, responded immediately. The sound of a trumpet cut through the chaos. The ceremony continued. But nothing was the same. Reeves was dragged away, his body jerking as he resisted, his shouts filled with an anger that had nowhere left to go. His badge shone under the morning light, but it meant nothing now. He was no longer an officer, no longer a man protected by the institution he had served. As he was pulled past the mourners, his eyes locked onto General Carter's one last time. His mouth twisted, but no words came out. She didn't look away. The funeral ended with the folded flag presented, the final salute given, but the real battle had only just begun. The video spread like wildfire. Within hours it was everywhere, on every news broadcast, across every social media platform, dissected frame by outraged citizens and commentators alike. A uniformed police officer drawing his weapon on a black female general at a funeral, the still images alone were damning. Reeves' gun locked in place, General Carter's calm, unwavering gaze, Captain Ruiz tackling him to the ground, the bullet soaring harmlessly into the sky, but leaving behind the scar of its intent. The headlines wrote themselves. Cop pulls gun on high-ranking black general at military funeral. Attempted assassination or another case of racially motivated aggression. Who is Officer Daniel Reeves? A troubled past comes to light. The last headline carried the weight of what came next. Journalists dug into Reeves' history, uncovering a rap sheet of complaints that had been buried under internal reviews and conveniently dismissed paperwork. Excessive force complaints, reports of racial profiling, testimonies from Black and Latino civilians who had been harassed, detained, or assaulted by him, all brushed aside under the guise of officer discretion. Now, those same cases were being unearthed, and the system that had protected him for years could no longer shield him from the firestorm of national scrutiny. The protest started that night. Outside the police department where Reeves had worked, citizens gathered with signs that read, "Justice for Olivia Carter" and "End Police Terror." The movement swelled with each passing day, fueled by anger, by exhaustion, by a collective sense of déjà vu. This was not new. This was not the first time. Inside a packed courthouse, the prosecution prepared its case. The charges were severe: attempted murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, hate crime enhancements. The trial was set to be one of the most significant law enforcement accountability cases in recent history. General Carter, though repeatedly asked for interviews, remained silent. She had always believed in the system, had given her life to serving it. But now, standing in its crosshairs, she understood what so many before her had tried to explain. She didn't need to speak. The world was watching, and for once it seemed they were listening. Inside the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. The jury, a mix of civilians and former military personnel, sat stone-faced as the prosecution played the video of the incident on a massive screen. The moment the gun was raised, the gasp in the courtroom was audible, as if the horror had just happened all over again. A former soldier, now a veteran advocate, took the stand. His voice was steady but cold. In a combat zone, when someone points a weapon at a superior officer, it's considered an act of treason. The punishment is severe. And yet here we are, debating whether or not a police officer in his own country had the right to do the same to a decorated general at a funeral. Reeves sat motionless at the defendant's table, his once arrogant posture diminished. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something to him, but he didn't respond. He knew. Everyone in that room knew. The prosecution brought in past victims, black men and women who had been subjected to Reeves' abuses of power. One man recounted how Reeves had slammed him against his own car for asking why he was being pulled over. A woman spoke of the night Reeves dragged her teenage son out of a coffee shop for looking suspicious. Case after case, testimony after testimony, painting the picture of a man who had been a danger long before he pointed his weapon at General Carter. Then came the defense. They argued that Reeves had acted out of fear, that in the heat of the moment he believed General Carter was a threat. The claim was ludicrous, laughable even, but no one in the room was laughing. They had heard this excuse before. The prosecution countered with a simple question. What was he afraid of? The silence in the courtroom was heavy. Fear had always been the justification. Fear of black men, fear of black women, fear of a world where their authority could be challenged, where power no longer belonged exclusively to them. Reeves himself never took the stand. Whether out of strategy or self-preservation, he remained silent as witness after witness dismantled his defense. The jury deliberated for days, but in the end, the verdict was inevitable. Guilty. On all counts. The courtroom was still, as if no one dared to breathe. Then, a single, quiet exhale from the prosecution's table. The weight of history pressing down on this moment was impossible to ignore. But justice, as always, was complicated. As the sentence loomed, debates raged outside. Some argued that life in prison was too extreme for a crime that had, technically, resulted in no deaths. Others pointed out that had the roles been reversed, if General Carter had been the one with the gun, there would be no debate at all. In her first public statement since the incident, General Carter stood at a podium, her uniform crisp, her voice measured. This is not about one man. This is not about one trial. This is about a system that has, for too long, allowed individuals like Officer Reeves to exist within its ranks. Today, a jury made a decision, but the real question is, what will we do with it? Her words echoed long after the cameras stopped rolling. The world had been given a moment of clarity. What they chose to do with it remained to be seen. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the verdict pressing down on everyone in the room. Guilty. On all counts. The words had echoed like a gunshot, but even now, with Officer Daniel Reeves convicted, the air felt charged with uncertainty. General Olivia Carter sat motionless in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her face betraying nothing. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. The judge's gavel struck, signaling the next phase of the proceedings. Sentencing. The prosecution pushed for the maximum, life without parole. The defense begged for leniency, claiming Reeves had made a mistake, that his years of service as an officer should count for something. The irony was bitter. How many men had stood before judges with far less privilege, far less protection, and received sentences far harsher for far less? The judge, an older man with graying hair and deep lines across his forehead, sighed heavily before addressing the court. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. The actions of the defendant were not just reckless, they were deliberate. They were fueled by prejudice, by hatred, and by a belief that his badge placed him above accountability. Today, this court rejects that belief. Reeves didn't flinch. He had long since stopped looking defiant. Instead, his eyes were hollow, his shoulders slumped. The uniform he had once worn with pride had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit. He wasn't a police officer anymore. He wasn't a symbol of authority. He was just a man waiting to be sent away. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The weight of the ruling settled over the spectators. Some exchanged looks of satisfaction. Others murmured in shock. A police officer sentenced to life? It was unheard of. The country had seen countless cases where officers walked free, where video evidence meant nothing, where the system swallowed up justice before it could take root. But not this time. Reeves closed his eyes as if he had expected this all along. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he barely seemed to hear it. The bailiffs moved in, securing his cuffs as they prepared to escort him out. As he was led past the crowd, he turned his head slightly, just enough to meet General Carter's gaze. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between resentment and regret, but Carter didn't blink. She didn't offer him the dignity of a response. She had seen men like him before, in war, in boardrooms, in every space where power was used as a weapon. Reeves was just another man who believed his authority gave him the right to decide who deserved to be where. And now, for the first time in his life, he had been told no. Outside the courthouse, the city was alive with energy. Protesters filled the streets, their signs raised high. Some called the sentencing justice. Others called it a travesty. News vans lined the sidewalks, reporters pushing microphones toward anyone willing to give a soundbite. "This is a landmark case," one anchor said into the camera. "For the first time, an officer has been held fully accountable for his actions." But will this be the beginning of real reform, or just another isolated case that fails to create lasting change? General Carter emerged from the courthouse to a swarm of flashing cameras. She had remained silent throughout the trial, choosing to let the justice system play out without interference. But now, the world was waiting for her to speak. She stepped up to the podium set up outside, her posture as unwavering as it had been the day of the funeral. The air was thick with anticipation. "I have served this country for over 30 years," she began, her voice steady. "I have led soldiers into battle. I have stood on the front lines of war. But nothing has prepared me for the battlefield we face at home." The crowd hung on her every word. This is not about one officer. It is not about one case. It is about a system that has for too long protected those who abuse their power. Today, justice was served. But justice should not be a rare occurrence. It should be the standard. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, others wiped their eyes. "I do not celebrate this sentence," she continued. "There is no joy in watching a man throw his life away on hatred. But I also refuse to mourn him, because today was not about him. It was about accountability, and if this country truly wants to heal, it must do more than punish one man. It must change the very system that allowed him to exist unchecked for so long." Applause broke out. Some chanted her name, others simply stood, letting the weight of her words settle in their bones. Somewhere across the country, in homes, in offices, in police departments, people were watching, some in anger, some in relief, but all were watching because for once something had happened that no one thought possible. Inside the courthouse, Reeves sat in a holding cell, staring at the gray walls around him. The sounds of the world outside had faded, replaced only by the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. He had spent years believing himself untouchable. But now he was just another inmate, waiting for a bus to take him away. The world moved on. The headlines would change, the protests would die down, but the question remained, lingering in the air like an unshaken shadow. Would this moment be the turning point the country needed? Or would it be just another case lost in history, another tragedy destined to repeat itself? Only time would tell.